On September 29, 2021, my wife and I hiked Mount Mansfield in Vermont. It was our third year in a row doing state high points, and we had already tackled Guadalupe Peak in Texas, Wheeler Peak in New Mexico, and Mount Marcy in New York. The summit of Mount Mansfield was our fourth, and it's the highest point in Vermont. There are a few different ways to get to the top, from driving part of the way, taking the gondola, or on foot. We wanted to hike the whole thing, so we chose the Mount Mansfield Loop Trail, which is about an 8-mile round trip. The weather wasn't great when we started, but it wasn't terrible. Then as we got higher up and hit the Maple Ridge portion of the trail, a heavy fog moved in, making things a little more miserable. Things were getting slick, and on one part of the trail, we had to climb a near vertical rock wall and jump over a section known as the Gap. We made it through, but the conditions got even worse. It was pretty disappointing, to be honest, since the views are supposed to be incredible, but we kept hoping the fog would break by the time we reached the top. Instead, it just got thicker, and my wife and I were trying not to be too bummed out about the fact we had traveled all that way just to miss everything there was to see. An interesting thing about this mountain is that when you look at it from below, the ridgeline resembles the profile of a face looking up at the sky. Because of that, there are multiple lower summits along the way that have names corresponding to parts of the face, like the forehead and the nose. After getting past those, we reach the chin, which is the true summit and the highest point in Vermont. The visibility was horrific, and there was some wind to make it even worse. At least we made it to the summit though, so we did what we normally do and took a break to eat. There were no other people around us at the top, so we found a sheltered spot next to rocks and sat down. Then, in the middle of eating, we started to hear something loud above us. This sound vaguely resembled a helicopter, but I don't like saying that because it's not totally accurate. There was definitely something in it that reminded me of blades chopping the air, but it was modulating up and down in a way that I've never heard before, and it had this eerie sounding echo. If it was a helicopter, something was seriously wrong. My wife completely agreed with me and thought it would be madness to even consider flying near the mountain in those conditions. It was incredibly dense fog, and I could have thrown a rock farther than I could see, so the idea of someone flying through that seemed insane. We got back on our feet trying to pinpoint which direction the sound was coming from, and this is a detail I remember very well. We never heard it approaching from any side. It didn't sound like something flying around us. It sounded like it had come from above us and descended down to the summit, and we both agreed on this. Then there was a 15 to 20 second period where it became intensely loud. During those short seconds, it was so powerful we could feel the bass in our chests, and I'm not kidding, we genuinely expected something to land or crash right there on the top of the mountain. Just after that, the exact opposite happened, where the sound got quieter, like it was going back up in the air. I want to reiterate this point too. At no time did we get the sense it was anywhere around the sides of us. It was definitely above. And it didn't sound like a helicopter as it was gaining altitude. It kept doing that up and down tone modulation, all while getting quieter until eventually we couldn't hear it anymore. I have been around plenty of helicopters in my life, just like most people, and I've even seen them up in the mountains. This was wildly different, and it didn't sound like anything else I've ever heard. My wife and I stared at each other afterward with this unspoken look of, let's get our butts off this mountain. We only stayed on the summit for a few more minutes, mainly to pack up our stuff, but as soon as we got that done, we headed down via the Sunset Ridge Trail to finish the loop and make our way back to Underhill State Park. About a mile down the trail, we ran into two guys who were probably in their 60s. We were doing the loop counterclockwise, but they were doing it clockwise, so they were still making their way up to the summit. We said hi, and one of them asked us how the fog was at the top. We let them know that the visibility was basically nothing. Then I also decided to ask if either of them had seen or heard a helicopter or any other kind of plane flying around the mountain. I explained the noise we had heard and told them how crazy it was, but they hadn't heard anything while hiking down below. One of them, who seemed to know what he was talking about, said there wasn't a chance in hell any sane pilot would be flying near steep terrain like that in such dense fog and wind. After talking to them, we were a little shocked that they hadn't heard anything because it was so loud when it was over us. I actually still find that hard to believe when I think about it now because it should have been audible for miles. When we finished the hike, we drove into Burlington where we were staying, picked up some food, and stayed in our room for the rest of the night. And I highly doubt I would be telling this story at all if nothing else had happened, but something did, and it only added to the overall nutty day we had had. Back at the hotel, we both needed hot showers after hours of hiking in wet conditions, and my wife went first. When she got out, she was complaining that her shoulders and her arms were red and tender when she touched them. I checked her out and it looked like she had a sunburn, which didn't make sense. Then when it was my turn, I had the same thing. The tops of my shoulders, my neck, and my arms were red, and all of it was sensitive to the touch. There was really no question. We both looked like we had gotten moderate sunburns. The major problem I had with that was that it shouldn't have been possible. We were both wearing long-sleeve base layers and full rain shells all day because of the conditions. At no point during the hike did we shed down to t-shirts or even take our coats off, so there's no explanation for sunburns in my opinion. Maybe there's something I haven't thought of yet, but I am convinced something lowered down to the top of the mountain while we were up there, and because we were so close, our skin was actually burned by it, or at least it gave us some kind of reaction. We have since done several other road trips and high point hikes, and we've never run into anything like what happened in Vermont. I won't go as far as saying there was something extraterrestrial in the fog above us, but it does give my wife and I the creeps whenever we talk about it. I have never told another human being this story, but I'd finally like to now. It was 14 years ago, and I would say it's rare if a day goes by where it doesn't at least cross my mind. When I was in my late 20s, my ex-husband and I were going through one of many rough patches in our short marriage. One night, we couldn't stop fighting, so I left our house and went to stay at my mom's apartment for a couple of nights. When this was going on, she lived in an apartment complex that was 1 block away from one of my oldest friends, Andy, who was in a neighborhood of brand new condos. So after spending some time with my mom, I walked over to Andy's to vent and have a drink. To get there, I walked from the back of my mom's complex through an opening in the fence, then took a trail across this small, undeveloped area with trees that went right into his condos. And before you get the wrong idea, Andy and I have been friends since elementary school, and he's not into women, so there was nothing going on there. He was also doing better financially than anyone else I knew at that age, with his own condo and a brand new Audi. It was a safe space for me, and he would always listen to my problems. I stayed with him for about 2 hours before walking back to my mom's, and while I did drink, it was only 2 glasses of wine over that long period of time, so I felt perfectly fine. I left his house and made my way back through that natural area again, but in the morning I couldn't remember actually getting to my mom's or going to bed, which was really weird. It was actually the first thing I thought about when I woke up in her extra bedroom, and I also had this sharp pain in my left ear like it was plugged or I was getting sick. The ear pain eased off after I had showered and eaten something, but as the day went on and I was at the apartment by myself while my mom was at work, I started to fully remember what had happened during that gap on my way home from Andy's, and it was really concerning. I remembered running into this other woman on the trail between the condos and the apartments, and for reasons I can't explain, we walked together and were talking. This was hard for me to wrap my head around because it's not something I would ever normally do, and it was in the middle of the night. Then I remember stopping with her, and this is going to sound like I'm making it up, but she was showing me the ground where our feet were, and it looked like we were standing on something see-through, and when I would move my feet on this clear floor, the pressure would make this blue light glow around them. I could also do this with my hands if I put them out in front of me. There was some kind of surface going all the way around us that I could touch but I couldn't see, and when my fingers would push against it, that same blue glow would happen around my fingertips. I don't do a very good job of describing this, but it was like we were inside of a big invisible egg that I couldn't see unless I touched it. I only had one other interaction with this woman, and that was when we gave each other a long hug goodbye for some reason. The way I remember this is when I leaned in and put my arms around her, I felt something really abnormal. Her shoulders and her back felt totally wrong, and when I looked down as I was hugging her, she had no shirt on and her skin was smooth and gray like a frog's skin or some other kind of amphibian. That was the entirety of my meeting with this person, or at least it was the memory I had of it. And I knew that I hadn't even freaked out about her skin, which if I were in my right mind, I would have screamed and run away. That part really made me wonder if it had been a dream. After the hug though, I was just instantly waking up at my mom's and it was morning. The thing about it is, I really had gone over to Andy's and I couldn't remember finishing the walk back to her apartment or coming inside, and I had no recollection of brushing my teeth or washing my face or actually getting into bed. That's what's always made this so confusing, because I wasn't drunk and I couldn't have gone into a dream halfway to my mom's. I kept this story tightly to myself for a long time and never mentioned a word of it to anyone because I started to wonder if I had had some kind of schizophrenic moment. I asked Andy some vague questions without revealing my side of the story, and he said I was perfectly fine and sober when I left his place. I think I made something up about not wanting my mom to know that I was drinking after fighting with my ex, and I just wanted to know if I looked drunk or out of it, which according to him, I didn't. This has been in the back of my mind in one way or another almost every day since it happened because it's very disturbing to me. I still don't want to talk about it with anyone I know, so this is probably the only time I'll ever put it out there. I know for a fact it wasn't the wine, so I don't know what else could have happened to me, and I can't even come up with a reason why I'd have these memories of being with that woman. I read somewhere that extreme stress and emotions can cause all kinds of symptoms, but the funny thing is I wasn't even that stressed out about leaving my ex for a few days. I was pissed at him, but it wasn't like I had a breakdown or was inconsolable and crying or anything like that. I just didn't want to see his face for a while. I wish I could get a clearer picture of the woman though, and more specifically, I'd like to know why her skin was like that when we hugged goodbye. It was all so random and odd, like an ultra-real dream while being fully awake, and I would never get that friendly with someone I ran into in the middle of the night for any reason, man or woman. Since this is anonymous, I'll give you my opinion. I think it actually happened and I encountered some other life form in that piece of forested land between the condos and the apartments. Why our two paths crossed is a mystery to me, but this woman was obviously something else, and it was like she wanted to meet me and she showed me the pod or the craft that she was traveling in. I feel so confident it wasn't a dream too, because no one just loses time and whole pieces of their night like that. I fully intend to keep this to myself forever because I'd like to avoid being seen as the crazy one in my family, and especially with my mom. She's the type of person who would recommend I check myself into a mental hospital for something like this. So as much as I would love to talk about it, the risks of putting it out there in my circle have never outweighed any reward it might produce. What I'm going to describe started when I was only 10 years old and I am now 66, so we're talking about something that happened well over 50 years ago. Because of that, there are parts of my original experience that aren't exactly clear. I don't have many of the specifics and I can't even give a perfect description of what I saw, but there is a piece of it that's never gone away and I can tell you about that. When I was young, I would spend weekends at my grandparents' house about every other month. My grandfather would usually pick me up from my parents' house after school on a Friday. Then my parents would come and get me the following Sunday. They lived out in a much smaller community in the country about a half an hour away, and I used to love staying with them. One Friday morning on a day that I didn't have school, my grandfather came early to get me, and I can only guess what time it was, but probably around 6 or 7 a.m. I don't remember anything about where we were, but while we were driving, my grandfather started leaning forward over the steering wheel and getting very worked up about something he could see out the windshield. I had never seen him act like this, and it got my attention, so I leaned into the dash too and tried to see what he was looking at. What I remember is that there was something actually flying above our car, and the image I have of it in my memory is unlike any other sightings I've heard of. I also want to be clear about the fact that I'll be describing a childhood memory that's over half a century old. When I picture it, I see a long piece of dark basalt rock with columns running along the bottom going lengthwise, and it was big, like the size of a semi-truck. If you look up pictures of basalt columns, you can see what I'm talking about, but all over the world that kind of rock forms into long hexagonal shapes that are packed tightly together. I use this analogy because it's the closest comparison I can make, and what I saw looked like a huge chunk of basalt hovering over the car. That's really as much as I can say about the sighting itself. I don't think anything happened to us, and I don't remember him pulling over or stopping the car as far as I know. We just kept driving to their house. I do remember him acting unusually excited about what we had seen afterward, but he never said what he thought it was, and the rest of the weekend at their house was just like every other one. Very shortly after that weekend with my grandparents, I began to have these short episodes where I thought I was having vision problems, and one of my earliest memories of this was at school. I was at my desk in the middle of class with a girl named Jillian sitting in front of me. That day, she happened to be wearing a plaid dress, and while the teacher was going on in the background, I found myself deeply focused on the square patterns in her dress. As I stared at the fabric, I started to see small movements inside the patterns, and I don't mean the squares themselves were moving around on her dress. It was more like they had a depth where the lines of the patterns contained even smaller patterns inside of them, and they were all moving. The longer I looked at this, the deeper it seemed to go. I actually leaned forward with my elbows on the desk to get closer, and in doing that, I could see even smaller shapes. I felt like it would go on infinitely if I just kept staring at it. I also realized the longer I concentrated, the farther it would go. I could focus on a single shape, then smaller shapes would appear within that, and even smaller and more complicated ones would show up inside of those. Each level seemed more intricate than the one before it, and it gave me this strong sense of being pulled in. On that first time, my concentration was broken when class ended, but it wasn't the last time. I kept seeing this, and it wasn't limited to flashy fabric or anything else specific. It also wasn't something I could control. Every once in a while, I would just fall into this concentration where I could stare at something and see layer after layer of tiny moving parts within it. Those parts would break down into even smaller pieces, then those ones would go into even smaller ones. At the time, I didn't know anything about physics, but it's what I would imagine an atomic level might look like. I'm not saying that's what I was seeing, I'm only trying to describe what the experience felt like. Another notable incident from when I was young happened in a movie theater. While I was there with a group of friends, I kept getting pulled away from the movie to stare down at the carpet on the floor. Every time I concentrated on the pattern, I saw the same thing happening, but that time was even more intense, where the moving parts were compounding and folding in on themselves, creating these incredible geometric shapes. It looked like an unfathomable structure underneath, and it was like seeing the infinite machine that creates our reality. At the same time this was going on, I started to notice something new at my grandparents' house, and this became important to me later on. They always had this notepad by their phone in the dining room, and I would see sketches on the pages where half of them would be covered in hand-drawn geometric shapes. Apparently, my grandfather had a habit of doodling on this pad whenever he was on the phone. I saw these drawings a lot when I visited, and even though they weren't pictures of anything recognizable, they were fairly complicated patterns with smaller shapes inside of the larger ones, and they all had a layered quality to them that reminded me very much of the things I was seeing. I asked my grandmother about the drawings because of the similarity, and she told me they were nothing. She said he just liked to doodle while he was talking and blamed it on his constant need to fidget. My grandfather kept drawing these things throughout the rest of his life, and I always wondered if he was seeing the same things I was. I also found it interesting that he never did that before our experience in the car. As for my visuals, they have never stopped. I'm much older now, but it still occasionally happens, although for some reason it's become much more rare with age. I've never found any trigger for it, so I don't think it happens because of something. I will just slip into the right mental state while looking at an object or a pattern, and I can see that movement and complexity again. I have long accepted that I don't know what this is, and up until very recently I've never heard or seen anything else like it. That was until I came across a video on YouTube that gave me the shock of my life. I'm not sure if it was related to my search habits online, but YouTube recommended a video that was a simulation of what it looks like visually when a person takes DMT. I had never heard of DMT before seeing this, and I didn't know what it was, but I was curious and I watched it. What I saw on that video was so eerily similar to what I'd seen since childhood that I almost couldn't believe it. The simulation had this overall feeling of moving forward through a tunnel, but the walls of this tunnel were made up of geometric shapes and lines that were constantly moving and folding in on themselves. Then within those shapes were even more moving parts and patterns, and it had an identical complexity to the things I'd seen for so long. Of course, the TV screen couldn't reproduce the depth of seeing it in person, but the resemblance was amazing. After that first video, I found many others like it and learned what DMT was. Since I've never had an interest in taking hallucinogens, I had no intention of trying it, but I really didn't need to because it happened naturally to me. What I've never been able to figure out is what caused this to happen. From everything I can remember, it started after the drive with my grandfather and the memory of seeing that giant rock above his car. I never saw these things before that, and they've never stopped since. And I really believe my grandfather was seeing the same things. His geometric doodles seemed to start around that same time period, and nervous habits or not, it became something he did for the rest of his life. I saw his drawings everywhere as I grew up, and they always reminded me of the shapes and structures I would see when I fell into that state of mind. But my grandfather and I never once sat down and talked about it, which is something I deeply regret. And because he was gone before I was an adult, we never discussed what actually happened in the car either, which I wish we would have. Whether any of this has to do with UFOs, I can't say, but I know what we saw above the car that morning was highly unusual. We encountered something on that drive, and whatever it was, I think my grandfather and I were both affected by it.